number of topics which is going to be of interest. John is a bureau chief with the State Fire Marshal's Office. John's going to talk about the new international fire codes for the year 2000, what direction the codes are heading, sprinkler system design and installation problems from the authority having jurisdiction's perspective. John has over 19 years of experience in the fire service, including the past 15 years in fire prevention, inspections, code enforcement, and investigations. 1997, John was appointed to represent the NFPA on the development of the International Fire Code. And he served as an alternate on the IFC Scoping Committee. And he's one of 12 national fire safety experts on the IFP Prescriptive Drafting Committee right now. His fire and life safety interests include fire protection systems, means of egress. In addition to this work, on the IFC, John serves as one of NFPA's regional fire code development committees. He's been involved in development of prevention-related courses at the National Fire Academy. And without further ado, John, I'll let you take over right now.
I have a friend of mine who's a pilot for Northwest Airlines, and as a sideline, he restores old military aircraft, particularly like World War II vintage aircraft. For some of you who know a little bit about airplanes, he's in the process of restoring like 3 de Havilland Moss. They're relatively rare airplanes, but they're real nice, and it kind of jogged my memory there when he was telling the jokes, because I said, you know, I saw him looking at his plane one day, and he said, well, and there's a real good reason why the British have never developed a computer. And I said, why is that? He said, they could never figure out a way to make it leak oil. These things are notorious oil leakers. So I got a few, before I get started on the presentation, I got a few announcements that I want to make, a good news, bad news thing. I'll start with the good news. I'll pass this around so you can each get a copy of it. Our division has hired a fire protection engineer. We'll start work on March 18th. Many of you know this gentleman because he frequently attends this meeting. Rich Pearson will start working for us March 18th. Rich is completing his studies at WPI with a PhD in fire protection engineering. So many of you know Rich, and next time you see him, he'll probably be employed by our office. He was going to try to make it to this meeting, but he called me today and I asked if this was a local or long distance call, and he said long distance, so I knew he was still out in Massachusetts. So we're real proud and pleased to have him on board. He's got a real good background in performance-based fire protection, computer modeling, and a little bit of background in sprinkler design, so he'll be a real nice addition to our staff. So that's one thing you're getting. Now the bad news is, for those of you who don't know it, Mary Nachbar is leaving our office. Mary is taking the Washington State Fire Marshal's job, which is a heck of a promotion. She'll be leaving March 20th. She has about a month left with us, or a little less than a month left. So there is a retirement party for her, which is March 18th. I'll pass around a sign-up sheet, a brochure on that if you're interested in attending. I know that Mary has spoken to this group on a number of occasions, and she's clearly a leader in fire protection, public education, juvenile fire center issues. It's going to be a real loss to the state, but we never begrudge somebody who has the opportunity to grow and get into something better. So best of luck to her. Let's see if I can get this working. A lot of when I do need to apologize, at the last moment I tried to get these printed up, and some of them didn't print out too well. So I was trying to put them on 3-hole paper, and most of them are backwards, but oh well. This is kind of the outlines. You can follow along tonight. If you don't like the way they're punched, go find your 3-hole punch and punch them on the other side. They'll work just fine. Do that or put them upside down. You can kind of follow along with what we're going to talk about. There has been a movement for about the last 5 years to go to an international fire code. At present in the United States, there's 4 different fire prevention codes, and there's 3 building codes. And the issue was trying to get one national code so that the designer, the installer, whatever, could go from any jurisdiction to any jurisdiction and have a common code. So it wouldn't matter where you were designing at. So the various groups got together to try to come up with one of these, and I was privileged enough to represent NFPA as one of their committees to do this. And this is a first draft of that product. It was completed in about October, I think it came out. Yeah, October. There was about a 2.5-month comment period which ended in January, and they're going to have some hearings in April on this. So this is what I'm going to give a brief overview of this. However, since, and this is very timely that I'm talking, and I didn't know this when we originally set this up with Phil, but as of last week, NFPA has backed out of the development of this document. There's a number of reasons for it, most of which I don't have the time to go into, but NFPA did not think that the fire service was being well served by this particular document. I'm passing around now a letter from George Miller, the president of NFPA, along with the press release that they put out, and that explains some of their reasoning and logic on why they're backing out. But as for right now, I'm going to take a snapshot of what this code is going to look like and some of the stuff that went into it, just so you have a little bit of understanding. Where this is going to go from here is anybody's bet. I don't try to make a lot of predictions for the future because in the past I have been real successful at that. I thought that George Bush was going to win the election back in '92, and I was wrong. Good thing for the press because they've had Bill Clinton to pick on the last 3 months. So, but I don't know what's going to happen with this development of this international fire code now. It's kind of up in the air. There's two possible approaches. NFPA may request that everything that they put into that document be removed, in which case it would probably got about a third of this. The other approach might be, okay, you just pay us, send us a check for our part of it or whatever. I really don't know. The lawyers can hassle that out later, but it's very timely that I should give this presentation. But that part I'll make relatively brief, although it's the majority of the slideshow, but we'll go through it fairly quick. The second part I want to touch on is some of the common fire protection problems that we see in terms of particularly sprinkler installation. I want to focus on tonight. How many here are in the sprinkler industry, contractors, installers? Typically that's the lion's share here. Okay, good. Some of these are going to hit home to you. Some of the things I'm going to say you're going to like, some of it you're probably not going to like. Some of it you may want to argue with me, but we're going to put it up anyway and show you this. So let's start first and go through this, what we're looking at for this fire code. There were two main organizations involved. One's called the International Code Council, which we'll call ICC because everyone's into acronyms nowadays. That was made up of the three building code organizations, BOCA, the building officials and code administrators, International Fire Code Institute, which is an arm of the International Conference of Building Officials, and the Southern Building Code Congress, SBCCI. Now each one of these codes has kind of carved out a geographic niche in the country. Primarily west of the Mississippi is International Fire Code or the Uniform Fire Code. Northeast is kind of BOCA, even down to like Illinois and parts of Wisconsin is BOCA land. And then Southern kind of has, down south, primarily southeast, although they go over into parts of Texas. And then, as we said before, NFPA was a player in here until they abandoned that effort or withdrew from it last week. This is very, all this is happening relatively fast. Some of the basic assumptions that we were operating on, first, the International Building Code had already been drafted, and we were given some marching orders that the International Fire Code couldn't conflict with any of the other international codes, the International Building Code, or any NFPA documents. And for those of you that know anything about the code business, that does constrain you to some degree if you're told you can't conflict with anything else. In other words, the person who got there first gets all the good stuff, and you get the crumbs, which is, I think, one of the reasons that NFPA has since pulled out of this. There's a lot of concerns coming from the fire service community right now that they're a little upset that fire safety decisions are being made by non-fire safety professionals. And a good analogy I heard came from the Chief Fire Protection Engineer for the Chicago Fire Department earlier this week, who said, architects and building officials are making fire safety decisions that firefighters who are yet unborn will have to live with. I thought that was a pretty poetic statement. And that's true because those decisions typically live with the building until it burns down or falls down. And I think it's safe to say that building officials as a rule are probably not as pro-sprinkler as fire officials are. Building officials tend to be more in the line of compartmentation, fire-resistant construction, and some of those things. For those of you who haven't figured it out by now, I'm very much pro-sprinkler. Very much. The other constraint we were put under was the International Fire Code had to be developed in 4 months. We started the 1st of May and finished the 1st of September. That's a pretty ambitious project. Considering that the International Building Code had about 2.5 years to put that together, we were given 4 months. So we met for 3 days every 3 weeks from May till September to get it out. Some of the other basic assumptions is we had to use language from one of the 4 model fire prevention codes. Well, we didn't do that. We applied that pretty loosely, and I'll tell you about some of the places that we applied that pretty loosely. But that gave us the opportunity to fix what we thought were some obvious holes, and one obvious hole I'm going to talk about a little later. The fire code was supposed to reference existing standards wherever possible, rather than extracting text, except what was needed for a fire inspector in the field. In other words, this book is supposed to be the Bible that you take with you when you go out inspecting. So you only put in there what you need out in the field. You don't put the whole NFPA 13 in there or NFPA 72 in there because you don't need that in the field. Those are primarily installation standards. Some people call it a maintenance code. That, to me, is like fingernails on a blackboard because that's not what a true fire prevention code is. There are a lot of philosophical differences. There's 2 main ways of looking at this. Primarily, the hot button is retroactivity. How far back do you go into an existing building and make them do things? Okay. People don't care so much on a new building because you're starting off with whole cloth. You know, it's somebody's concept there. To make them sprinkler it or do this or that is really not that difficult. But when you get into a building that's there already and now you're talking about retrofitting and potentially big dollars, that can be a real hot button for a lot of people. So there's 2 basic philosophies that come out from the issue of retroactivity. One is minimum requirements. The code just sets the minimum requirements, and in theory, every building in the state or in the town or whatever has to meet those minimum requirements. That's a philosophy that 2 of the model codes use, 2 of the model fire prevention codes. That's kind of an NFPA philosophy. We establish the minimum requirements here. The other philosophy is what's affectionately known as a distinct hazard. There, the code official determines that something's a hazard and causes it to be corrected. The problem with this is that this can be accused of being very discretionary. Is the code official just doing it to this particular building or only with this particular issue? What happens from jurisdiction to jurisdiction? You know, I think this is very critical, but you go to the next community and they think some other issue is very critical. So there's really no uniformity when you start crossing boundaries. And once again, 2 of the other model fire prevention codes use that philosophy, including the Uniform Fire Code, which is our primary document in Minnesota, uses this distinct hazard philosophy. So trying to meld those 2 philosophies was very difficult in the fire code because everybody recognized they had to apply to existing buildings. How do you do it? Which philosophy do you use? Related issue, and this is one of my hot buttons also, is compliance with the previous edition of the code and prior approval of the code official. There's a lot of people that think if somebody ever blessed this, that it should be able to allow it to remain in that condition henceforth and forevermore. Like every other line of work, code officials have made mistakes over the years. We do all the time, actually. Even the code has made mistakes. There was a point in time when you could build a high-rise building, as long as you sprinkled it, you only needed to have 1 exit out of it. Now, most of us, by today's concepts, would say that was wrong. That was a bad decision. But I can take you to downtown Minneapolis where there are buildings like that right now with one exit because they're sprinkled. That's not that unusual. That was legal for a couple editions of the code. So what do you do with those now? How do you treat those? Most of us, even in a sprinkled building, are pretty uncomfortable with only 1 exit, especially in a high-rise building. That fire gets set at that base of that 1 exit. That could be a little uncomfortable there. So a lot of people on the committee felt that existing conditions that were approved must be grandfathered. Okay, other people on the committee, like me, argued very strongly against that. Okay? I don't happen, the fire codes are developed as a result of experience. If we have 53 people die in a motel fire because of this or that problem, there may well be a new code come about to address that. The codes are, based on experience, typically bad experience. So just grandfathering because some code official blessed it once upon a time is not necessarily good. Let me give you the classic example, since a lot of people here are involved in fire protection issues. Let's take the classic spec warehouse that was built under maybe a light hazard or even an ordinary group 1 hazard. Okay, spec warehouse. Now they move in high pile combustible storage. Well, once upon a time that was approved. It wasn't approved for that use, but it was approved. Some people argue, well, that was approved, so you gotta live with it. I think most of us in this room recognize that there's a great difference between 20-foot high piled plastics or flammable liquids versus a spec warehouse, with nothing in it. So that's something that most fire officials would argue needs to be upgraded. But there are some code officials who would argue, no, somebody approved it, you live with that. That was a decision made. And others felt that prior compliance didn't negate all potential hazards. Some of the options, make it applicable to both new and existing. That's kind of a Southern and NFPA philosophy. Make it applicable only to new conditions. That's a typical building code philosophy. You make the fire code applicable only to existing conditions. That was kind of nobody's philosophy. Applicable only to new unless specifically indicated for existing. That's kind of a uniform fire code philosophy. You make it applicable to existing unless specifically identified for new. That's a BOCA philosophy. Each chapter contains a scope statement identifying the applicability, or each section contains language identifying the applicability. Those were kind of the 7 issues that we looked at, or 7 options for how do you deal with retroactivity. What it says is that existing conditions constructed prior to any code or requirements constructed in accordance with the prior code. New conditions is obviously anything constructed after the adoption of the current code. Is this document perfect? Absolutely not. Is it all bad? No. I'm going to talk about some of the good and some of the bad. It does apply to new and existing. We'll just go through some of this quick. Applies to conditions arising after the adoption that's new and existence, i.e. existing, and the distinct hazard test in there. That's probably going to be challenged during the hearings. It did allow existing conditions not in strict compliance to remain as long as they were legally in existence, i.e. grandfathered, and they didn't pose a hazard. Kind of worded a little different. This is intended as a reasonable or common sense approach. For instance, if the code says you need a 36-inch wide door and there's an existing door there that's 34 and a half inches wide, you make them rip out the whole door in the frame for 1.5 inches. Nah, it's probably close enough. It's kind of a common sense test. Kind of compliance with the intent versus the letter of the code. Did put in an alternate if the building complied with NFPA 101, the life safety code. It was considered to be in compliance with this. Recognize that NFPA 101 is a very, very common code used in existing buildings, specifically adopted in 33 states, used by the federal government for Medicare and Medicaid funding, and then also used as the federal detention correctional standard. There's another one in there. If you met the requirements for existing but didn't meet the requirements for new, you could keep them, but you wouldn't be able to go backwards. Basically, you don't. If you got a sprinkler system in there, you leave it in there. You don't take it out, kind of thing. That's kind of the philosophy there. Uses a new term, code official. We're used to fire chief. Probably going to be challenged quite a bit. Still uses fire chief, but only to address operational issues like what you do at a fire. Placed all the definitions into a single chapter, chapter 2, so you don't have to look 2 different places anymore. And it also gives a reference to where it's used. General precautions, I'll just go through this real fast. These are the different topics that it covers. Some of these I really wondered why they're still here. Chapter 4 is emergency planning. Chapter 5, fire service features, requires an access and water supply at the time of construction. Fire department access roads, access to buildings, address numbers, key boxes, markings of shafts so firefighters don't fall in. Fire protection water supplies and hydrant systems. Whenever you're melding 4 different philosophies from 4 different areas of the country, the easiest way to sell something is go to the lowest common denominator. You usually don't take the strictest of it, you take the loosest of it. And that's something that happened when they dealt with water supplies and fire hydrant systems, is when you get down south and out west, it's very common for them to have much longer spacing of hydrants than we have in the Northeast and the Midwest. We tend to go about a city block, roughly 300 feet. When you get to other areas of the country, it's not at all uncommon to have 700-800 foot spacing of fire hydrants. And so there was a little bit of movement here, but they said, okay, 400 feet is if you're more than 400 feet from a hydrant, you got to install another hydrant. That's really 800 foot spacing if you think about it, because you're in the middle before you'd be 400 feet away. And then it increased that to 600 feet for dwellings or sprinklered properties. Now, one of the philosophies that we tried real hard in here was to give a lot of trade-offs, bad word, but to give a lot of code exceptions for sprinklers. This was one of them. You get a 50% increase for hydrant spacing for sprinklered properties. Chapter 6 deals with building services and systems, things that were a hazard. Fire-resistant construction is covered in Chapter 7. One that I think was very interesting was that it's in the International Building Code also. If you have some kind of a fire-rated assembly like that wall, let's say that was a firewall, up above the suspended ceiling, you'd have to stencil on that firewall to not penetrate. And the logic there is so that the cable TV guy or the telephone guy doesn't come by and knock a hole like this big to run the phone cable or TV cable through. And that's a very common problem that we see a lot of times. So there's a requirement in the building code now, in the International Building Code, when they adopt it, that would have to be stenciled so that hopefully the maintenance person or the utility person is up there will see that and won't go knocking great big holes through it. So we thought it was a good idea and brought it into the fire code, although some people are screaming about it. They don't mind it so much for new, but they really don't like that in existing conditions. Well, that's when we're seeing the problem is existing. So then floor openings and shafts, which is one of the most common causes of fire spread in buildings vertically. It allows some multiple story open atriums, covered malls, escalator openings. Most occupancies you can be open 2 stories. If you get beyond that, you got to enclose it or sprinkle it. Interior finish, decorations, furnishings. We put an exception in there for Christmas trees. We said you could have them in sprinkled buildings. Basically prohibited now. Getting the one that most of you are interested in, that's fire protection systems. Required that systems had to be maintained in accordance with the original installation standards. That is getting to be, I know why people like that, but it's also from a mechanical standpoint, it's becoming very difficult because you now have to keep 14 editions back of NFPA 13. What was it originally installed under? And try to keep track of all that. For those of you who have followed the evolution of codes, how do you know what was really in there 10 editions ago? Some of you old timers in the room would know that, but that's getting to be real difficult to do. Even look at the densities, how much they've changed over the years. So I understand why that had to be in there, but from a practical and realistic standpoint, there's going to come a time when we're going to have to make a decision. What standard do you maintain these systems to? You can't keep going back to the old one. I mean, literally, we have sprinkler systems installed in Minnesota that were put in back at the turn of the century. What do you maintain them to? Who's got a copy of the 1903 NFPA 13 or whatever it was called back then? So, if you have a non-required system, they are allowed to provide partial protection. Whatever is installed has to meet the applicable standards. Acceptance tests are still required. That was a big debate that came about there again. Some of this was to try to get partial sprinkler systems. Some of us are of the belief that half a loaf is better than no loaf at all, or partial alarm systems. And Some people say, no, you can't do it, you got to do the whole building, you can't just put in part. Or like in my case, my house is sprinkled, okay? It's not required to be sprinkled, there's no code that says it has to be required to be sprinkled. Now, what do you install that to? How do you maintain that? So that was some of the debate that went on to try to address that. It's broken up into several different sections: a general, definitions, a section on automatic sprinklers, other fire extinguishing systems, standpipe systems, portable fire extinguishers, alarm and detection, smoke control, fire department connections, and fire pumps. The book is actually laid out in a very logical sequence right now. That will probably change after a lot of amendments are added and it gets older and people put in stuff over the years, but right now it's laid out very good. Chapter 10, means of egress, another important, broken up into several components, different sections, talking about the various different egress components. Special hazards, aviation facilities, covered malls, dry cleaning, dust explosion, construction demolition, flammable finishes, fruit and crop ripening. That's one of my favorites. I don't know why that's in the fire code anymore. But people thought it still needed to be there. So, fumigation, insecticidal fogging, HPM, which is what is that? Something production materials. It's semiconductor manufacturing, basically. Lumber yards, woodworking facilities. By now, I'm sure that you're all ready to lose it. Special hazards, organic coatings, industrial ovens, service stations, repair garages. This is the one I want to talk about. Storage of combustibles. They put both miscellaneous and high pile combustible storage into one section. I know that a lot of you deal with this issue. One thing they put in there is they eliminated curtain boards in sprinkler properties. That's a proposal that's in here. Something of a fight, but they finally said it's time for that to go. For those of you who have followed the issue, the old draft curtains and venting and these high-piled storage buildings, originally a lot of that testing was designed around non-sprinkler buildings. So it really doesn't make any sense to impose sprinkler requirements on non-sprinkler buildings. And that's kind of been the approach. I don't want to quote somebody else, but that's kind of been the approach that like Factory Mutual has taken for a number of years. Because they really don't want these, especially with the ESFR technology, which we're seeing in a lot of these, but we just eliminated a blanket across the boards. I'm sure that'll be challenged, but that was a hole or a problem that we saw in the codes, and we said, this is the time to fix it right now. So, tents and membrane structures, tire rebuilding, welding, other hot work. Then the last 13 chapters or so are on hazardous materials. Don't ask me any hazmat questions. I had a hazmat lobotomy a number of years ago. I know nothing about hazardous materials, but they broke it up. If you'll notice a trend here, these are in alphabetical order to make it a little easier. It should be easier to find things in alphabetical order than trying to look by whatever order they used to be in. So. Now I want to get into some of the sprinkler design and installation problems we're seeing after the water break here. This will be near and dear to some people's hearts. Some of the common design problems we see, particularly with calculation and remote area problems. Not enough sprinkler heads in the remote area, or not enough sprinkler heads being calculated. Seems to be a kind of a common problem, and we discussed this a little bit at the table. If I can make two general statements that we're seeing. Number one is we have a, and I don't mean to insult anybody, but I'm just kind of going to lay it the way that we seem to see it. We seem to have a new young generation of sprinkler designers coming up. And many of these people don't seem to know some of the basics about sprinkler design. They never had to lay one out by hand with a slide rule and do the longhand calculations. They're used to inputting it all in the computer, and they're very good with that stuff. But they don't know some of the basic assumptions that go in. And so on the one hand, we have this, what I call the new younger generation of people who are doing this all on CAD. That's the only background they have. And then kind of a related problem is, I think the industry is very busy right now, and there's a tendency to be a little sloppy at times. So we see all kinds of weird things, like the hydraulic calculations are showing 13 heads, but the plans are showing 15 heads in the remote area. Well, what happened? Did you have an on-off switch on the last 2 heads? You just turned them off and decided they weren't going to run? Just little things like that. So something happened between the plans and some of the inputs where 2 heads got all of a sudden lost. Right? So that's one that we're seeing. Obviously, wrong density. That's a fairly common one. I know that gets to be a judgment call sometimes, but sorry, if you're doing a high-piled storage, you're not going to get away with light hazard. It just isn't going to work. Okay? People have tried. It's not going to work. Labeling of rooms. That one gets called out quite a bit, where we don't know what the room is. Is it a mechanical room? Okay, that's one thing. Is it retail, mercantile? Is it an office? Is it a bathroom? It changes the density, changes the spacing. Selection of sprinklers. I was just talking to our plan reviewers today. I said, okay, what kind of things you see? And well, he had a set of plans here, and okay, the plans were showing ELO heads. The calcs were showing ESFR, or excuse me, the title page, the face sheet, were showing ESFR, and the calcs were showing standard heads. Because the K factors were a standard head, showing 7 PSI. Okay. For ESFR or ELO? I don't think so. That's what the calcs were. Okay. So somewhere, the little mechanical problems are getting lost between them. I suppose you could screw all 3 different types of heads into an outlet, but it's not going to work very well. So pay a little more attention to that. Some other remote area problems. Existing combination domestic and fire protection water supplies. One thing we tried to do early on when we started this program was we knew that we were going to have a lot of existing buildings that had a decent-sized water line coming into them. Okay, how do you deal with this? Do you make them rip up the street and lay in a new 6-inch line when they got a 4-inch line or a 3-inch line or something coming in? We said, no, we want to try to work with this and allow them to sprinkle using the existing water. So we said, okay, we'll let you do that. And we kind of use like a 25% ratio, like if the domestic needed 1 inch and it was a 4-inch line, probably let you do that. If the domestic needed 4 inches and you had a 4-inch line, we probably wouldn't let you take fire protection off of that. Okay. But what we did say is, okay, you can put like a diverter valve on it. Got this 4-inch line coming in, put the diverter valve on there, and the water flow goes off, and everything gets dedicated to the fire protection system rather than domestic. So we have kind of used that, but we've seen a lot of things come in where they're not showing any information about that. They've got 1 4-inch line coming in, not showing any information about that. So our approach there is, well, then you have to put the diverter on, which I understand it has some expense involved. So you need to prove what's there in terms of domestic fire protection. We will let you do that. We'll let you use the line, but there's going to have to be some calculations as a proof that that line will be able to support both functions. To do that, you're going to have to dedicate it. And sprinkler head pressures and flow is incorrect. Well, that's a real common one, and especially now with all the different types of heads out there, the old 15 and 7 isn't necessarily so anymore. That's what I grew up with. Okay, if you can get those 2 numbers, that's all you want to do. And that most certainly isn't true when you get into ESFR, ELO, these extended coverage sidewalls, extended coverage, everything. That's not true anymore, but I think we still have some designers that go back to 15 and 7. They just get that at the end head and everything else will work. And not so anymore. Some design and installation problems we're seeing. Extended coverage are giving us fits. Spacing is too close, actually. Not having a problem with these being too far away. We're having a problem with these being too close. Got to watch for the extended coverage because there's minimum spacing requirements. And you can't just, oh, well, we can put them 6 feet apart. Can't do that necessarily with every one. Too close to walls and too close to each other. Okay. So that's a problem with some of the extended coverage. Must be installed equal-sided dimensions. That's right in NFPA 13. You install them 16 by 16 grid, 18 by 18 grid, 20 by 20 grid. Okay, we get a lot of installations where it's, well, this head is covering 16 feet by 17 feet. So The demand area is 16 by 17, whatever that works out to mathematically, so that's what we're flowing for. Oh no, 13 says that's an 18 by 18 foot spacing. That has to go up. You can't do that with extended coverage heads. They have to be in equal-sided patterns. It's another common one that we get into. Sidewall sprinklers. Ordinary hazard does allow you to use them in ordinary hazard, but the maximum spacing is 10 feet, not 14 anymore. Separation distance between them. That one's a real common one. Well, they still stretch them out to 14. You can't do that in ordinary hazard applications. Not installed properly. This is a real common one. They don't have anything behind them. You know, as most of you know, one of the basic concepts of a sidewall sprinkler is you need something behind it to collect the heat to activate it. We have these things hanging out in the middle of nowhere. They'll drop them through the roof and put a T and go in two directions off it. No can do. You need a wall or a barrier or a soffit or a lintel or something behind it to collect heat to activate that thing. Sitting out in the middle of the ceiling, it's not going to do any good because that's not how they're designed to work. Obstructions are a big problem with sidewalls. I should have brought the slide in. I got one. This happened to be in a church, and they went through one of the big beams on the sidewall, and not 2 feet away is another beam hanging down there. That's covering nothing other than it's going to wet the inside of that other beam. That's all it's going to do. Some of the things we're seeing in the field, working without permits. All I can tell you is please don't do that. The law and the rules both say you need a permit. Now, if you can work it out in some jurisdiction, Jurisdiction X, and you just say, I'll be coming in tomorrow to pull a permit, but I need to start work on this today, and they say fine, okay, that's fine. That's something between you and the jurisdiction. But don't do that as a rule and just say, well, because I don't need it in Minneapolis, I'm not going to get one in St. Paul. Because you're going to get stung with it sooner or later. You need to work something out, and you need to get a permit beforehand. Our office is pretty good about early work authorizations. We'll typically let people start working early on a project, you know, with some basic information about what they're doing as plans are being developed and some of these fast-track things. But you're going to have to get a permit, and that's been one of the biggies right now that we've brought some contractors up for. And we got a few more pending right now, so please don't do that. We don't want to suspend contractors. That's a suspendable offense. I know that some of you here in this room have been brought in on that. It's no pleasure for us to lay off 50 people for a week because somebody didn't pull a handful of permits. So please don't get into that. That's about all I can say. Working without supervision. I see our 417 rep here. This continues to be a problem. We have a lot of work going on right now that doesn't have a journeyman on the site. You're required to have a journeyman on the site. That means on that job. Now, I know that a lot of you don't have problems because you got a 4-to-1 ratio of journeymen to apprentices anyway, but we do have problems with others that have a 1-to-4 ratio, and they want one journeyman working 4 different jobs. Can't do. You have to have a journeyman on that site. Another very common one. We've seen that quite a bit. And the locals have the authority to shut you down right then, and they probably will. I mean, that's within their right to do that. If you get caught by a local official for that. Kind of a stupid one, seems nitpicky, but the spare head box, one of each type. Dave Stegura was just relating today, he went out on an inspection. They had 19 different types of sprinkler heads. 19 different types of sprinkler heads in this job. And of course they had the head box there with 6 sprinkler heads in it. Technically, you have to have 19 different types of spare heads. I think you're supposed to have 3 of each. So, I mean, you're talking about multiple spare head boxes there, but that's... And he thought somebody just cleaned out their spare stock back in the shop and just brought out 6 heads or whatever they had there. Hangers, crooked hangers, you know, almost at a 45-degree angle. And then hanging from other mechanical systems, ductwork, other piping. That's a no-no. Sprinkler piping, as most of you know, has to go back to the structure. That's a real common one. We find it hung from ductwork all the time. Find it hung from other piping all the time. Typically, though, we're not seeing a shortage of hangers. They're putting enough on there. And the other one that I want to bring to your attention is what we're seeing in, particularly some of you in the engineering fields will understand this real well, is we're seeing these pre-engineered truss joist roof systems where everything is engineered right down to the minimum 45-pound snow load or roof load or whatever it is. Okay, some of those cannot support the weight of water-filled sprinkler pipe. You may have to spread that out. You may have to run a stringer across several of those, because if you try to screw into just one of them and put that much weight up there, it will probably cause the roof to collapse. There's no safety margin built in. So watch that if they're into one of these engineered roof systems. You may be tying on to several of those with your hangers, not just one. You probably can't go just one point on a 2x4 there. Probably not going to let you do that. So the sprinkler work, and this is going to be a difficult one, and I put this under the ethics issue, and I put that in quotation marks, and I know some of this is going to get your hackles up, but we're concerned about an emerging trend that we're starting to see in the sprinkler industry, and I don't know if this goes back to the fight between the sprinkler contractors and the engineers. I don't really know what is behind this, if it's just because people are so busy, but we're seeing what appears to be people intentionally doing work incorrectly in an effort to get change orders. And this happens quite a bit. We go out in the field, the fitter says, I know it's wrong. Did it wrong. Boss told me to do it wrong. I did it wrong. I knew you were going to be here. I knew you were going to call us on it. You'll have to process a change order. I did it wrong anyway. No, I knew you'd catch me. And seems to go high up, right in the organizations, up to management. So that's an area that's causing us some concern there. Everybody's busy right now, and so I don't know if that explains it or whatever, but kind of distressing for us to see that, because we're trying to go out there and promote sprinkler systems, and all of a sudden they cost twice as much as what everybody believes it should. So. Let's see. Any other issues we want to cover? No, I think that does it for me. Any questions? Anybody got one equal time? Complain? Tell me I'm wrong? Yes.
You mentioned the International Fire Code, NFP's things off committee, but what about the National Uniform Fire Code or Building Code? Anything interesting in that?
The building code is probably still going to proceed. The International Building Code is still going to go. They're still going to go with this International Fire Code to have some hearings in April. But what it's going to look like is anybody's guess right now. So there will probably be some sort of national code. But my best guess right now is we're probably going to end up with 2 fire codes in this country, which some will argue it's better than what we have now because there's 4, so you cut it in half. There's still some rumblings out of California that they might want to write their own also, so we might end up with 3 of them. But the inherent differences philosophically between NFPA and the ICC, I don't think we'll get to one code, at least not right now.
Tom, I'll offer one comment and one rebuttal. My pet peeve on your design is a water test taken in December without taking into account the lower pressures in July and August, and then designing up to the curve. This is done all the way through. The kind of rebuttal is a little bit more on what the NFPA kind of standard. I'm past chairman on the NFPA 61 technical committee, and I have a pretty good idea of how the NFPA works. One, they're under a court order based on other things to have a consensus standard. And the realization is in making a standard, there are other people besides a small interest group that have knowledge and have interest in making that code work for them. Like on the 61 committee, we have the insurance interests. We have the people that build equipment. We have the users. We have the union. We have academic professors from Iowa State. And we had other people on that committee that all worked in towards one common goal to come up with a standard. Now my understanding is the difference is that in developing this code, you had a narrow segment of the population. Narrow segment doesn't say they're not knowledgeable or they're not well-intended, but you had the building officials, and they were making the code with no real input from the overall people that had to live with that code. They may have a little bit different idea, a little bit different introspect of what is going on. And this, I think, is where the difference in philosophy is, not so much of what you're doing. I think they're both pretty much lockstep in that direction. But how do you achieve the final end goal? Do I, as a user, have to live by the code, get an opportunity to put input into the code, or is it only people from the State Fire Marshal Office or BOCA or ICBO or whoever it is that has the opportunity to put in the code that I'm going to have to live with? And I think that is a basic difference in the philosophy between the NFPA and why the NFPA finally pulled out. And the fact that the NFPA is under a court order for a couple of things that they did, and also a couple other results where they didn't do something, OSHA came in and did it on their own, that the NFPA is elected to go with the pure consensus standard. Otherwise, I think what you're given here is very good, very basic, and I believe the philosophies of the two organizations, what they want. And lockstep is just, how do you get to that point?
No, Tony, you're absolutely right. That is one of the base issues, is who gets to vote. Whether you like this code business or not, it comes down to who's writing the codes, who's selling the codes, and who's using the codes. And the middle one, there's a financial interest for some people in there, and there's interest for people who want to develop it as to whether they can vote on it. Can they write it and make it? And the ICC philosophy is that only code enforcers can write it, can vote on it. And the NFPA philosophy is to balance it. Not more than 1/3 of any special interest group, including enforcers. There's goods and bads in both. I'm not here to debate that. But I have seen situations where code enforcers voted on something because they thought it was a really good idea, and the practical reality is it wasn't possible to do. And because you don't have industry there as a check and balance to say you can't physically do this, that gets to be a problem.
Give an example. City of New York, in the city, requires a fire department connection every 300 feet around a building perimeter. This is for the ease of the firemen. Now, maybe they're still using a hand pumper out there in New York. I'm not quite sure. Every 300 feet, they're required to have a fire department connection. It's ridiculous. That's the city code.
One of the good things is I had a chance to review the International Building Code draft, and they tended to follow along the lines of BOCA, and BOCA was very pro-sprinkler in their codes. Those of you who have done work out, like in the northeast section of the United States, you'll probably understand what I'm saying. They're much more pro-sprinkler, and they were willing to trade off a lot more things in the code for sprinkler protection. And that did come through to some degree in the International Building Code draft. The class example that's near and dear to my heart is fire-rated exit corridors. The International Building Code is going to say you don't have to do it in a sprinkler building. For those of you who are in the design community, they're telling us to design a fire-rated exit corridor is about $6 a run and foot. And that's this wall, and then you have the wall on the other side. So that's a very expensive protection and probably won't work. As soon as somebody props a door open, it's defeated. So, there did seem to be some of those types of philosophies coming through, which I thought were very good. And from that respect, it would be nice to see that type of code, because right now, the building code in Minnesota would not permit that. John?
Not a rebuttal, but just your gut feeling, how many of the design problems that you have up here were caused or maybe due to the fast tracking by general owners? You would see the construction stages that are handed out now, they are in some cases unapproved. It forces the designers to do calcs extremely quickly. Get the project on a Friday, and they want money to turn around Wednesday the next week. I was just curious,
I think that a fair amount of this is driven by the whole issue of the industry being very pushed right now, whether it's just because there's more work than they can man right now, or because it's fast track, or combination of the two. I don't know, you know more about the industry than I do from that respect, but clearly it's a push somewhere. And that's why I say some of this is like, I guess I'd characterize it as sloppy, and that's maybe too strong a word, but clearly somebody was rushed and forgot a step in there.
the next comment is, we are probably the heaviest regulated industry in construction. And the PDEs, the architects, and I said the other day, when the city reviewed our plans, you can't put the Siamese connection in it, it's just out, you gotta put it on the front of the building. And I said, well, it's shown on the plans that you reviewed. He says, we've never seen these plans. How come on the front end, these plans aren't gone through by the city for review? Just on basic design, we get so many plans into the office where it says sprinkler the whole damn building. That's the specs, that's it. And then they say, have it by Tuesday and start on Wednesday.
Yeah,
I can volunteer something on that from what I've known experience. Some municipalities do not include their fire service as part of the review process. They just have their main building official or main code officials review the plans, and a lot of times the fire officials are left out of that loop. Why? It's budget, egos, there's a lot of reasons why, but that's what happens in many communities, to where the local fire chief or fire marshal on the initial building review, a lot of times are kept out of that loop.
I feel sorry for some of that pipe, everyone, someone working on it, would help.
Well, it starts with the head building official. If they choose to include, each discipline, including the, Fire Prevention Bureau in on the review process, then you get more of a thorough review. But it's the head building official that makes the call on whether, and a lot of times it's ego driven to where they feel that they have the competency and years of experience, and they've been doing this for this many years, and why should they involve more people? And they feel absolutely has to be in the process. It's a lot of things go into that.
For some of you who have followed the whole issue with the professional engineering board and the sprinkler contractors, and this fight's been going on for 8 years or better. One of the comments that's been made in some of those discussions that we've had with the State Board of Architecture and Engineering is that, well, maybe if you do elevate sprinkler contracting or the sprinkler installation to a higher level in the design process, because what we typically see is that the sprinkler contractor is a sub to the mechanical contractor, who's a sub to the general contractor. They're so far down the food chain, nobody's thought about it until the last trade there, and if you got a mechanical contractor completely forgot about it until the last minute, he's probably calling you on Friday and telling you to be there on Wednesday. I don't doubt that. It would be nice if right from the get-go that the sprinkler contractor was a main contractor like the electrician or somebody else, working right up front, right on the front end, and he could get some of those things ironed out. I mean, if you had 3 months to lay out the system, that's a lot different than 3 days. But I don't know why they're not doing it. Maybe that's one thing that may come about with this engineering thing if it ever gets worked out. That the sprinkler design will cease to be a forgotten function until the last minute. That's where the rub comes in for me.
I may shoot myself in the foot here a little bit, but it doesn't matter how big the project is. It doesn't take but a couple hours for the engineer up front to call the city and say, where would you like to sign these? Here's the densities we propose to use. What kind of backflow prevention do you want? I just did a review with the city of St. Paul on a 15-story building and talked to the guy for 40 minutes. We went through 90% of what those questions are that I think show up as something that's forgotten on the plans. So I think some of it comes in trying to elevate the engineering community to do that on the front end. I can't blame the cities for not reviewing a Siamese location. I think the engineer has to find the right person at the city to ask that question. It doesn't take much effort.
And I also think, to add on that, Al, well, the right engineer. See, it's easy for, let's say, you and I to raise those questions when we do design on a consulting basis because we both have contracting background, having worked with sprinkler contractors in the past. We're used to asking those kind of questions, where not all...
I've been working on an ad hoc committee with the Consulting Engineers Council that you might be aware of. But we put together a complete guideline, and the effort of it was to try to elevate the quality of what engineers put on the documents for sprinklers. It was purely a sprinkler committee, it wasn't anything else related to the overall scope of fire protection. And so we're still in the process of getting that pushed through the Consulting Engineers Council. But at some point we hope to have a document that has a checklist. Here's what you should have on your plans. Here's what you need to check on with the city. Here's what you should do for field inspections, shop runs, the whole gamut. And so we're working to help out.
I tend to agree with John. Probably 90% of the specs that we see come into our office, you could sprinkler a two-room outhouse, or you could sprinkler the Mall of America with. I mean, they're so generic that they're made to cover the whole spectrum of everything. That the boilerplate language somebody pulled out of something, and they're not, most certainly not specific to the building in question. And that's been a concern that we've had. They don't fit. It just doesn't fit. Okay.
John, one thing too, I don't know with your working with codes, how much you cross over into the other disciplines, but like one of the things John mentioned, like with the fast track buildings, where you see so much of that, like with the plumbers and mechanicals and stuff too, the general says, we need you next week. Well, they just come out there next week and do it because they're just doing bits and pieces. Whereas one thing where we are mechanical firms, so even within the office, I can argue with some of the guys on that point where at the fire protection, we have to draw the whole building, go out and get it approved and get a permit, and then they can go out and start. And these other guys just start with the next week and go bit by bit. I was wondering, how much do you see that in other trades or something that, or you might call it enforcement through codes or something like that, that is coming on for things like that, or it's just for fire protection?
Probably relatively little in some of the other trades, and some of you that have a better engineering background, which is probably everybody in the room than I do, can address this. But so what if they if they got to run 10 more feet to get to a toilet? Does it really goof anything up? Other than the additional cost. It is pretty critical when you're getting into fire protection components. Are they installed right? Are they probably going to work as delivered? Because one thing I think we all want to avoid is a system that doesn't work. It's really bad publicity all the way around. So, I don't know if you're the most heavily regulated construction industry, but you're probably up near the top end. I'll give you that. Clearly, at least in our books, fire alarms and sprinkler systems are cut above other trades, and we argued that with the sprinkler licensing law when that went through. We're not selling asphalt driveway coatings, as a quote my boss used to make. I mean, this is life safety and property conservation. So it does need to be held to a little higher standard than some of the other trades. I understand all of this coordination problem. That's why our office tries as much as we can to allow like early work authorizations and put the plans in here when you get them in here. But we understand you have to start working. You have to start hanging some of the pipe, and maybe it's not that big a deal to hang some branch lines and drop some outlets down. That's pretty typical in terms of sizing. When you get back to some of the bulk main and some of that, then you get a little more goofed up. But it is, eventually it has to be done, no doubt about that. Any other questions? Thank you.